and welcome to HerStory. This particular quote is from the author of a book on Venus and Archeoastronomy, if you care to look her up. And you can take your time to read it. What I draw most from this quote is, or encapsulates some of what my thinking has been on Venus as I've looked into her over history and what the archetype means. In short, I feel that the Greco-Roman representation of Venus, and it isn't just a feel, it's actually historically accurate, is quite patricized, and the way that she's even been scaled down in the way that we understand her today has stripped away a lot of what the depth of this archetype has to offer us and the different goddesses and mythology associated with her. As Helen here says, the goddess of Venus is a symbol of resurrection, and a belief in the afterlife is an essential element of the human psyche. This isn't something that we typically, as astrologers, attribute to Venus. Because, we're thinking, again, a lot of times I think that the inner side of Venus, Venus's ruler of Taurus, gets missed. And when we think of Venus's ruler of Taurus, we have to bring in the polarity, which is Scorpio. And in her early mythology, certainly with Inanna, which we'll get into in part 2, the underworld journey, etc., this is a very strong part of this archetype. So for part 1 here, I want you to have in your head, just framing it within your head, of thinking of Venus as the ruler of Taurus, because we're going to be looking at the deep history here, our archaic ancestors, which goes back to pre-written history. Okay, I'm going to be using some terms, and this is why I put this up. Oh, hold on. Oops, I'm sorry. I almost ended the meeting by accident. I was trying to move this box out of the way. Paleolithic, Mesolithic, and Neolithic. When you hear me using these terms, I want you just to be able to see the era that I'm talking about. The Paleolithic era is mostly thought of where we were nomadic, we were hunter-gatherer, tribal, clannish, and I would add also very shamanistic in our consciousness. In the Neolithic era, we have the rise of agriculture and settlements, and out of that come city-states and political and military structures. So the Mesolithic era, which is this what archaeologists would call this transitional time, is where the transition from simply being nomadic hunter-gatherer to agricultural happens. The Mesolithic era doesn't have set dates because it changes every new archaeological find that they come across. So it really has changed a lot, even in the last few years. Most of what I'm focusing on, I'm going to start a little bit with the Paleolithic and go through the Mesolithic into the Neolithic. This image that I have here is a very interesting find. It's very unusual for graves of its time, and it is actually a female shaman. In the correct parlance, that would be a shamanka. And it's very unusual in the position that she's in, and also with what's been found with her, these artifacts that have been found with her. What identifies it as a shamanka is this forearm of this wild boar that's fused with her own bones. And, that leads to this understanding of shamanic consciousness and a kind of picture of what our archaic consciousness was like, where it's fused with nature. And when we think of shamanism as we know it today, it has a lot to do with, animal spirits, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is from the Natufian culture, which was in the Levant. When I give this lecture live or parts of this lecture live, I often ask people how old they think war is and the history of war. And most people respond pretty much as long as humans have been humans. And, you know, some might give it 100,000, a couple 100,000 years. The archaeological evidence for war is only 10,000 years old. The first evidence of war shows up at 7,000 BC, and it's only in one rock painting in Australia where it shows an intertribal conflict. The way that archaeologists know this, because, you know, weaponry can cross over to hunting and fighting, but what's most noticed that starts to change around 7,000 to 5,000 BC is that there were massive settlements of people, even from this nomadic hunter-gatherer to the agricultural settlements. There were massive settlements, and none of them had fortifications. None of them had walls. And that really didn't start to rise until around 4,000 or 5,000 BC. And actually one of the first recorded walls that walled city-state is Jericho, which, you know, from the Bible has something to do with the walls falling down. And that's an area of the world that we'll be focusing a lot on the second webinar, the Fertile Crescent, etc. Okay, so as I said, I want you to think of Venus as ruler of Taurus throughout this first part, this part one. So we know Venus as ruler of Taurus rules the senses. And so I thought, well, when I was putting this slide together, I did a Google search, and I would ask you to do this because it's kind of funny. Go to Google Images and type in sensual or seek sensual images. And what you will find is a few pages before you get to anything that has to do with the actual senses, you'll find a lot of eroticized feminine form, lips and curves and boobs and mostly naked. And interestingly, no male forms, so it's all feminine. And this relates to what Helen was saying in the opening slide, that this is what the feminine has become for us in today's society. Now, I also looked up the definition of sensual, and I'm going to read you a few of these because it's kind of interesting. On one definition of sensual, there's let's say five different there's a noise in the background there. I don't know somebody's microphone is on.
I've muted.
Okay. All right, so sensual. The first description is pertaining to, inclined to, or preoccupied with the gratification of the senses or appetites, carnal and fleshy. So we're starting to already see that the very first description of sensual has a moral overlay. You can guess where that comes from in history. Second description, lacking in moral restraints, lewd or unchaste. Fourth description, worldly, materialistic, irreligious. So, you know, this is already pointing out how far removed we are from the container of our body. Venus is ruler of Taurus. I often place that rulership as the etheric body. It's the subtle template for the physical body. And so we can say that it also relates to the physical body as well. Finally, on our description of, or our dictionary description of sensual, by number 5, they get to of or relating to the senses or physical sensation, sensory, which to me is exactly what sensual is. And this particular picture to me is what I believe is the level of sensual that I wish to communicate here as far as Venus is ruler of Taurus. This is the ability to be open and naked to the world and to be impressed upon by nature, by others. And when I say Venus is ruler of the etheric body, and we know that the senses fall into that, the senses are the passageway of how the outer world comes into the inner world. What happens is that the loss of our sentient ability and the disconnection from our own bodies and from our own sensate nature, and the narrowing of that, again, just like the example of, the feminine erotic form is what we consider sensual. The narrowing of that is the numbing of our ability to be impressed upon. When you think of the zodiac wheel, the first 3 signs of the zodiac wheel are the most primal. So we have Aries moving into Taurus, moving into Gemini. And I want you to think of each sign kind of arising. It's like an evolution of consciousness. Not that Aries is, primal, but is less evolved than Taurus or less evolved than Gemini. But to think of them as each one builds upon the other one. And if we think of the evolution of consciousness or even the development of personality and the development of our transpersonal selves, you can follow it around the zodiac wheel. So to understand Venus as ruler of Taurus, we're thinking of that as arising out of this. For me, I start with Pisces because Pisces is the alpha omega. So Pisces is the primordial ocean, the void, that which everything arises from and returns to. And Aries is the first separation from that void. It's the assertion of our will. It's the assertion of individuality. And in Taurus, we have that sense of will and that sense of self that turns inward and then grounds into ourselves. So as I said, that the senses are the passageway into ourselves. Well, Venus as ruler of Taurus is also about our inner nature. Feeling belongs also here because senses are feeling ruled. And when you think of the zodiac wheel, feeling precedes emotion. Emotion is emotional reaction is a Cancerian thing. So part of the pathology of our society, and also just the unfortunate incident of having occurred, many of us through many lifetimes, I'm going to throw reincarnation in here too, through many lifetimes having incurred traumas to our bodies, our physical bodies. The etheric body is the one that carries those traumas life to life for the physical body. Having incurred those and still carrying them life to life can give us a progressive sense of numbing. So feeling itself, the word feeling, means to perceive by touch or to be moved by the senses. How we are touched or moved by the world comes through our etheric physical body. When it's numbed, when it's shut down, when it's been traumatized, or even, as I was saying, I feel collectively numbed, then we don't even get to the wisdom of the emotional body. So this is also part of what I feel we've become estranged from, that is very clear when you study ancient history, and this is what I want to immerse you in now, is the understanding of what our archaic consciousness was like, what we were like when our consciousness was fused with nature, when all of our senses were alive and open to be impressed upon by the natural world, and the delight of our senses. So here, I want you to start to meet our archaic ancestors. This is an image of one of the most ancient forms ever found, human forms. In fact, it is the most ancient human form ever found. It's the Acheulean goddess, this one. And you can see from the dates that it's possibly dated as far back as 800,000 BC. This is the Venus of Tauntaun, dated around 200,000 BC, and this is the more famous one, more recent, 28,000 to 2,500 BC, the Venus of Willendorf. An important point to make here is the amazing similarity of all of them through this massive stretch of time. This is something that modern archaeology has had a difficult time getting its head around for a variety of reasons, which I'm going to get into in a second. The biggest debate on this Acheulean goddess is if it was man-made or not. And for a long time, archaeologists were saying that it was just a natural form that people picked up and maybe embellished upon. And they did the same with the Venus of Tauntaun. When this was studied microscopically, it did show traces of red ochre, which our archaic ancestors used a lot, and also microscopic modifications. But the debate raged on because to allow for the possibility that this, which is clearly a female form, carried through to all the Venuses that were found around this era, is basically to say that there was a continuous culture that was matrifocal, or as some archaeologists would call it, gynocentric culture, for almost 800,000, if not more years, an unbroken cultural tradition. That's the real debate. And that's been the real problem. In archaeological circles, just don't think that any of our sciences are set in stone, and archaeology is one of them. Just like we astrologers, not that they would consider astrology a hard science, but we certainly do apply scientific rigor to our field. Just like we argue with each other about house systems, sidereal, tropical, blah, blah, blah. Well, in the archaeology world, this is it really is one of those sciences that's rife in, because a lot of the findings are related to how they're interpreted. And a lot of times it's taken from present day consciousness trying to look back and interpret what they might have been doing from our lens. And the lens that it's mostly been looked at through historically in archaeology is the male patriarchal lens. Many of our sciences follow that model. Archaeology is one of them. Up until only recently, and I'm really talking 2013, 2014, it was widely felt and understood, and I'm going to say believed in the archaeological world, that Neanderthal man, well, because you would say, oh, what a Neanderthal, right? Like caveman, stupid, doesn't know anything. That was the belief. What they have found over and over again are complex graves, complex social structure. I'm just pointing out, for example, with Neanderthal, that goes back to 350,000 years ago. So they now have had to reconcile that Neanderthal was equally as intelligent as what they would call modern human. And this was all supposedly before written language. I've talked about, I mentioned the word patriarchy, and I just want to say something about that quickly. It certainly is something that becomes gender-based, male, female, but more so than that, it's a socio-political kind of cultural system that we are born into, at least now, and it's less about gender and more about values. Patriarchy in general isn't explicitly about male dominating women. It's more a system that has to do with upholding traditional male qualities as central, while everything else is subordinate to that. And some of those attributes of or things that are valued in patriarchal culture are like power and control and rationality and linear thinking and extreme competitiveness, which, you know, we might say are traditional male qualities. So, some of the feminine qualities of, let's say, emotional expressiveness, compassion, are subordinate to those values. That's what gives us a patriarchal culture. Patriarchy, by the way, really, and this is what we get into in part 2 even more, really only has a history of about 7 to 5,000 BC. And we really see it clash in the mythology in around 4,000 BC. So my point, if you think of the other slide, there's a woman who wrote a book. I don't think I have it. I don't have it on here. It's called 500,000 Years of Peace and 7,000 Years of War. What they're painting a picture of, some of the archaeologists that look at a lot of the findings are painting a picture of a vastly different kind of consciousness that we have had, that was predominantly centered around an iconography of the divine feminine. These are some of the terms that the archaeologists and different writers on this give that kind of consciousness. It's not matriarchal in opposition to patriarchal. That's actually a patriarchal overlay to think that that means, well, then women had the power and they were the clan mothers or the tribal leaders. There's evidence of that for sure. But, and I'll get to this in a second, so I won't jump ahead of myself, but that's not what it means. So they've come up with these different terms to describe what our archaic consciousness and what the structure of our societies were at that time. And these are some of the terms: matristic, matrifocal. There were matrilineal lines, that it was gynocentric. And the one that I like the most is sacriarchal. And sacriarchal is a term that's explaining that we were immersed in life as a sacred process, and that process involves an acute attunement with nature as well as the cosmos, that we're just seeped in the sacred, and that all of it is viewed as sacred. And of course, as you know, we see remnants of this in tribal societies, even though they've been decimated and patricized themselves. I want to single out this woman, Dr. Maria Gimbutas. A lot of my research comes from her, as well as many of these people. You may not know her, but I'm going to tell you about her briefly. She wrote 20 books. She was an archaeologist from the 1920s and lived until 1994. She was an extraordinary woman, multiple professorships, Harvard, Yale, UCLA. She's got, like I said, 20 books, about 300 articles. But what made her extraordinary as an archaeologist is that she was able to read 16 languages. She was a linguist as well as an archaeologist, as well as a mythologist. And she turned the archaeology world on its ear, because she was one of the first people to take all of these findings and use her cross-disciplinary or her cross areas of expertise and draw some conclusions. Prior to that, there was a very simple classification: squiggle on a cave, or a triangle in a cave is just a triangle on a cave. Nobody was really looking at it because there wasn't any belief that there was language then. And so she developed a theory through all of her research that is so hotly contested still in the archaeological world. It was called the Kurgan invasion. And what she asserts is that the earliest societies in Europe were neither male-dominated nor were they primitive. That there was a clash of cultures that happened and these Kurgan people that came down from the Pontiac steppes somewhere along the Black Sea around 5000 BC down into the Fertile Crescent, which is where we start to see the rise of warlike cultures and patriarchy. That they clashed with more of the kind of peaceable people living there that were matristic and were matrifocal. She's been slammed in the archaeology world that, well, she's one of those figures that either you love her or you hate her, and she has equal people support her in the archaeological world as well as detract from her. This book, Language of the Goddess, I believe Joseph Campbell wrote the foreword to that, and Joseph Campbell even said about her that he wished he had met her prior to doing all of his research on the hero's journey, which which is one of Joseph Campbell's hallmark works, is looking at the monomyth of the hero's journey. So Marie Gimbutas is the one who kind of drew together all of these findings. Her specialty was Eastern Europe, but and also the Indo-European kind of Bronze Age, Paleolithic age. But she looked at all of the archaeological findings to draw her conclusions. If you want to understand it, these are all resource books that I have. If you want to understand it, this woman's website, Max Dashow, has been documenting a lot of these findings since the 1970s. And there's a particular article you can Google called "The Furor over Gimbutas." Furor as in F-U-R-O-R over Gimbutas, and it's a very scholarly, like 20, 30-page article that's counterpoint on what Marie was presenting and where her detractors were and where her supporters are. Do I hear a question?
Actually, it's just a quick comment for me. We are having a storm moving in here, and I want to make sure that you've clicked your recording, because I think I might have lost a little bit of audio briefly, and I don't want to have that happen again.
Yes, I did, but the only problem is this box that I have here is laying over my slide, and that's going to be...
Oh, all you have to do, it will not show. And if you want it to go away, in the upper right-hand corner, there's a little double arrow thing that'll shrink the control so it won't be in your way.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. That's better.
Okay. Yeah, I just don't want to have Mercury continuing on a retrograde when it's not supposed to, and that we lose part of this.
Okay, but the box won't show anyway, right? Is
the
that
box
what you
will
said?
show anyway, exactly.
Okay, great. Okay. Yes, I did start recording at the beginning.
Perfect, because with the storm here, I'm beginning to get nervous.
Okay, okay, great. So as I was saying, folks, you can Google "The Furor over Gimbutas" if you're into reading. What she inadvertently did, and she was an archaeologist, and she wasn't really interested in influencing sociology so much, but what she actually inadvertently did is she became the patron of, like in the 60s, and prior, some of the deep resurgence of the goddess movement. For example, this is considered one of the Bibles of that time, the Great Cosmic Mother, which drew largely on Gimbutas's work. Gimbutas herself was actually quite surprised at how much she had influenced these kind of feminist movements that arose out of that, etc. Okay, so Max Dashow has, hold on, I'm trying to get to the next slide. These are images, some of the images of the Paleolithic goddess, different forms, different shapes, found all across the world. They are coincidentally named. In one thing that science was interestingly, coincidentally synchronistic, was that these are all called Venuses. These are Venus figurines. Now, I'm not going to say that they have a correlation to the planet Venus, but archetypally, like I said, I want you to have your hat on, just thinking of Venus as ruler of Taurus. Max Dashow wrote, and Gimbutas talks about this too, And this is true. I've read these scholarly papers. I'm going to quote Max Dasha when she talks about how the archaeologists were classifying each one of these figurines. There's hundreds of them found all across the world. By the late 1960s, a reaction had set in against interpreting female images as goddesses or having any sacral or sacred power. The new archaeology turned away from cultural analysis to an emphasis on scientific progress and technology. The trend was simply to ignore the female figurines, although when they were classified, they were often classified in passing as, and these are quotes, fertility idols or fetishes. I want you to consider the word fetish. You know, it's something that's, it's folklorish. It doesn't really have a lot of sacred significance. They were also called dancing girls, fat ladies, and this one, I just recently saw an article that was written like this last year. Stone Age porn, Paleolithic porn, sex objects and concubines. Max Dasha goes on to say that most were squirreled away in obscure journals as tiny, poorly reproduced black and white shots, while male warriors got full-page color treatment in Dawn of the Man-type coffee table books, while the study of weapons and the mechanisms of war was preferred. So, you know, this is part of why her story hasn't been told, because even though there's an abundance of archaeological findings, they've been dismissed, just like anything that doesn't fit the popular theory of the moment, which is that we are a male-dominated culture, we are at the top of the pyramid, and we are the most evolved that we've ever been. Women don't really have much of an influence in that worldview. Okay. The reason why I say it's important to understand some of the mechanisms of patriarchy is because values define a culture. And, you know, I gave a lecture at Norwalk where I started to, just as an experiment, not that I'm necessarily wishing to change the face of astrology, but just as an experiment, I went through the idea that, you know, we have a beautiful balance as we go around the zodiac wheel of masculine, feminine, yin yang. You know, Aries is masculine, Taurus is feminine, Gemini is masculine, Cancer is feminine. It's a beautiful symmetry. But when it comes to the planets that rule those signs, we only have 2 feminine planets. So something's a little out of whack there, you know, again. So I just did an experiment of what would happen if, let's say, we renamed some of the planets and associated them with different mythology, even outside of the Greco-Roman mythology, such as Neptune. Neptune is ruler of a yin sign, but it's a masculine planet. Well, what about Tiamat, or what about Namu, one of the ocean creatress goddesses that comes from our deep archaic ancestry? So again, as I said, values define a culture, which is why it's important to understand what is being valued. So now let's start to immerse ourselves into what might archaic consciousness have been like. So as I said, we do glimpse it in tribal societies today. We do know that it was shamanic. It was fused with nature. We know, archaeologically, they know that our archaic ancestors, for most of, well, I'm trying to give it years, but let's just say up until 10,000 years ago, they lived in small, multi-family cooperative bands. They were tribal, they were clannish, they shared the same belief systems and values. They had moral and social values that were passed on by ancestral honoring and a code. The important code is that most of their law and their code was rooted in natural law and, important to notice, observable cosmic law. They had a cooperative organization, what we would call more egalitarian behavior. There's no evidence of kings, rulers, chiefs, chieftains. There may be clan elders, clan mothers, clan fathers. Gimbutas says of what she has seen of archaic consciousness is that the vast body of symbolism represents a cohesive and persistent ideological system that reflects an abiding respect and consciousness of interconnection with the cycles of life in nature and in the cosmos. A male archaeologist, Andrew Sherratt, says that there's a pervasive ritual and symbolic character of matristic society that lacks the mark of individual rank and achievement, which terrifies us today, because we're a very hero individualistic culture, and the idea of feeling submersed within the collective or subsumed by the tribe is actually something, especially American culture, because we're so individualistic, that we rally against. But I want to tell you, I was fortunate to spend some time with the Australian Aborigine. A few times in Australia. I was invited to give a 5-day workshop out in the outback with some Aboriginal people by the Cosmic Intelligence Agency Star Camp. And I got to hang out with these women and talk with them. A couple of them, one was a story keeper of their tribe, and another was a shamanka, what's called a healing woman, an enkare. And so I asked them as much as I could about their culture, and what I noticed from just being near their consciousness and immersed in their consciousness, they are not lacking individuality. In fact, the Aboriginal culture, for example, is the oldest continuous culture that we know of, even though they have been decimated. And those that hold on to their beliefs can go back 30, 50,000 years. So they are the largest unbroken peek into what our consciousness was like. And, they told me very clearly, I don't even have the words for how different it is when you hear an Aboriginal person say, the land does not belong to us, we belong to the land. And if I could try to sketch out that picture of how radically different it is than we are. I know, we say that in a kind of simple way, and it isn't. It literally is their consciousness and their stories and their ancestry and the dream time all exist in the land. It's a little bit too much for me to get into now, but this particular image that I have up here is an example of, like I said, two primary archetypes that we have in astrology today that we can call clearly feminine, the moon and Venus. And I want to refer to an Alouette elder. His name is, I'm trying to remember, Larry something. Sorry, I'm not remembering his name. You can look up his videos on YouTube. It's called The Cosmic Womb, or The Womb at the Center of the Universe. And in those, he talks about how central woman is to their culture. As an Alouette elder, they also belong to one of these ancient Arctic cultures. He says, in native traditions, the source of all creativity is woman. Women initiated our shamans, and their biology attunes them to the mystical source of all law, knowledge, where the language of one can communicate with all and everything in creation. what he's referring to there, and the Aborigine talk about this too, this language of one is the knowledge that's already in the cosmos. It's already in the land. When archaeologists have looked back at culture and said, well, they didn't have writing, and so they must have been really stupid. What I learned from the Aborigine is they didn't have writing because they didn't need to. Because if your consciousness is attuned to the knowledge that's there, all you need to do is turn around and look at that mountain, and the story is there. It's the same when they look at the cosmos. Alouette goes on to say that the womb at the center of the universe is where we get our knowing from. Now, the womb at the center of the universe is the dark rift in the Milky Way, where the galactic center resides. They consider that the source of all life. They're not the only ones that did that. The Mayans did the same. That's what that whole 2012 stuff was about. And in their mythology, all life comes from this dark rift within the universe, which if you look at it, it looks like a vulva in the sky. It's undoubtable, when you see it. So what Alouette is saying is that their knowledge comes from there because their consciousness can be attuned to that. And it's a perennial kind of knowledge that also gives them, and the dream time to the Aborigine is exactly that. It's where their laws and their customs come from. So it's a dimension behind our dimension that they are simply attuned to. This is archaic consciousness, right? So again, hoping to immerse you in trying to feel what that's like, because this is a part of what all of our lost ancestry is about. Alouette goes on to say something about the externalization of the womb. He said, when women enact ritual in circle, they externalize the womb. They create the energy for transformation, creativity, birth, and transition. Women must collectively come together to conduct ceremony, to heal within themselves and create the container of creativity on the outside. Until this is creating, nothing new will be born. So the idea of the cosmic womb is, yes, it's where all life comes from and where it returns, but it is the archetype of creativity itself. This is where we draw on the combination of the moon and Venus as archetypes, the self-generative, as we know, Taurus is also about self-sufficiency. Okay, a soul male-oriented, okay, so we have a creator God in our Judeo-Christian Western world, and many cultures have followed that, or many of the stories that you know would relate mostly to a male-only divinity as far as a creator is concerned. That particular form of or worldview is only about 5,000 years old. So in ancient history, there's many creatress goddesses. And really, like when you think of it, I mean, it seems so logical. It's like women's bellies give birth, right, to both sexes. All life comes from her. How can, the image of the creation of life be male? It's almost irrational when you think about it. So I bring this up because, I want to talk about Venus's role in this also. So the moon, we can easily relate that to. And here's where we start to look at what some of our archaic ancestors have attributed to that archetype that we definitely see in some of the earlier mythology. In the Iroquois tradition, this is a picture of Skywoman, and she's a creatress goddess. She lives up in the sky with her husband. And in the sky world, there's they have these amazing powers in the sky world, and there's this tree that's in the sky world they call the celestial tree, and it bears all kinds of fruits, and it has this radiant light that lights the upper world. And Skywoman is pregnant, and one day she has this dream that the celestial tree is uprooted. And so she goes to her tribe and she tells the tribe about this. And as in tribal consciousness, dreams, of course, are important and usually means when there's a big dream, something needs to be done. So they go over to this celestial tree and they think maybe we need to look at the roots, or we need to dig into it. Maybe we need to uproot it. Maybe we need to do so. So finally, one of them does uproot the tree, and it opens this big hole. And Skywoman leans over to look into the hole, and she slips. And as she slips, she grabs several seeds and branches and leaves from the celestial tree, and she falls. Now, meanwhile, in the lower world, there's only ocean. There's no land, and there's sea creatures. They already exist, and they see her falling, and there's the winged ones also, here, the geese. They see her falling, and they're afraid that she's going to get harmed. So the geese rise up to catch her as she's falling, and they gently guide her down to the earth. Down to the ocean. There's no earth yet. And then each animal starts to think, well, she has no place to be. She doesn't have fins like us, or she can't breathe in the water like us. So we need to find a way to create a place for her to be. So they keep going down, and it goes on. Different animals keep trying, going deep down. The muskrat goes down, the turtle goes down. And finally, I think it was muskrat that does it, goes all the way down and gets a little clump of soil from the depth of the ocean and brings it up and puts it on Turtle's back. And then the geese gently put Skywoman there, and she lands, and from the seeds that she had grows the tree of life. And because she was pregnant, she also gives birth on this new land. The land, by the way, is Turtle Island, which is North America. This is what the native name for North America is. It's Turtle Island, and this is the creation myth of Turtle Island. Because Skywoman is pregnant, she gives birth, and she gives birth to first daughter. And then the story goes on, which I'm not going to go into. But part of what this story, and there's other stories like it around the world in ancient, in indigenous mythology, part of what this is showing, woman in archaic consciousness was frequently associated with the tree of life. The tree of life is the axis mundi that connects the three worlds. In the shamanic vision, there's an upper world, a middle world, and a lower world. We occupy the middle world. And the lower world would be maybe more synonymous with our subconscious, etc. Wait, I'm trying to move my thing because it's in the way. And spirit belongs in the upper world. So woman, because life comes through her, because her very biology is what draws the soul, the spirit into soul, into ego, into matter, and the passageway is her womb. So her very biology is what our archaic ancestors saw, in that she is the pole that connects the world. It's woman's biology, and it's the feminine archetype that connects the passageway between the worlds. It is the unfortunate thing. I mean, through her ensoulment happens, through her embodiment happens. Within the crucible of her womb is where spirit and soul merge, that kind of sacred marriage, which then births ego and then births matter. To our ancient ancestors, this was a most divine occurrence, the most sacred kind of occurrence. and it's unfortunate that it's exactly for the same reason once the Judeo-Christian and a little bit prior to that rolls around, that it's the exact same reason why woman becomes demonized, because it's through her body that we're drawn from heaven. In the shamanic view, what also is part of this tree of life, and it's a story like what Skywoman illustrates, is that there's, and it's in her story, as she falls already pregnant and then gives birth to first daughter, and first daughter becomes pregnant by the west wind. It hints at the philosophy of parthenogenesis, which is the ability to recreate from oneself asexually. And this is also something that's attributed to the feminine, the divine feminine, which is why the creatress goddess can be the primordial form out of which all of creation arises. Skywoman falling also relates somewhat to the descent journey that leads us to the heroine's journey, which I'm going to talk about more in part 2 when we talk about Inanna. But descent is a common theme, and this is where we really start to get Venusian. Because this passageway between the worlds that I was talking about, the connection of the inner and outer world, and this tree of life and the source of creativity is a deeply Venusian principle. I'm just going to stop and see if there's any questions.
No one has typed in anything yet.
Okay. Okay. Oh, the other thing about Skywoman falling that's interesting is, like I said, she falls with the seeds and the leaves from the celestial tree and replants them, and as I said, already pregnant. You know that every egg that a woman has is already formed in the womb. So when we are born, in those of us that are in female bodies this time around, all of the seeds of life are already within us, and none of them are created. They die month after month through the menstrual cycle, but none of them are created. So that shows a really deep kind of maternal lineage that happens biologically. Okay, now let me advance my slide here. This is the Venus of Hulfels. Some of the imagery of her exists in many of the different Venuses. What we see in this particular one is, of course, the exaggerated body form, the exaggerated breast, the exaggerated vulva, exaggerated buttocks, and no head. This is interesting. Many of the Venuses don't have heads, but what they've shown is that these little notches are what they tied, perhaps, say, a sinew, and they carried their goddess with them. So they wore it. They wore her. Many of these Venus figurines are worn by touch, so they handled them and carried them with them. You have to remember we're talking a nomadic people, so they brought their goddess with them. But for hundreds of thousands of years, this theme, this image of the divine feminine, has held true. This, exaggerated form. What we might look at, again, part of what they're portraying here, and as Venus relates to Taurus, is the ultimate in self-sufficiency, right? When we think of Taurus as being self-sufficiency and Venus as its ruler. Because here, this form has all the reserves it needs. It can birth, it can nurture. All of the seeds of life are already contained within it, and also relates to, and archaeologists have said that the exaggerated breast and vulva do relate to the principle of parthenogenesis. Interesting, just yesterday or the day before, there was a story of a shark that just reproduced in captivity through parthenogenesis, asexual, had been separated from its mate for 3 years, and she had offspring. I was talking about the Venus figurines, and somebody might ask about the penis figurines. This is an image of the penis of Holfels, but the interesting thing is that there's much less of these than there are of the thousands of great mother images that are, in fact, there's only maybe 100 of these found around the world. Anything that looks phallic, or what archaeologists would call ithyphallic. Even in cave paintings, what they found is that when the female form is represented, it's much more lifelike, it's voluptuous, it's coming off the wall with life, and the male forms are much more stick-like. And the representation of the male genitalia is much less. Again, like I said, in contrast to not only the hundreds of Venus figurines found, but the thousands of female images in cave painting and in pottery. So again, what they've said is that by that the abundant goddess then shows her as a driving principle for life itself. This particular one is very interesting. This is a male form, and as you can see, he has a bird head here, and it's ithyphallic. He's erect, and this is in the cave Lascaux. When I first saw this, my thinking went to some non-traditional research that we might call more phenomenological research. It was a woman called Felicitas Goodman, who also had looked at a lot of archaeological figures and the positions that they were in. And she found, across different cultures, there's one of upraised arms, and there's one with arms crossed across their chest, and there's one with, kneeling with hands on knees. So she did this phenomenological research by getting hundreds of people together over the years at her institute called Kayamunga, and they did journeying. So what they did, and this is exactly tuning into our archaic consciousness and what we are capable of, as well as because that's part of our psychic inheritance. So she'd get people, let's say, to kneel and put their hands on their knees and then journey. And then they would correlate where they went, what imagery they had, da-da-da. And she created a whole kind of ontology of what these different journeys were around these archaic poses. Well, when I first saw this painting, this is exactly what I thought was going on here. Now, the traditional archaeological description of this, I have to tell you that first, is that this is a hunter who killed this Oric bison, and here's the entrails, and before he died, or before the bison died or Oric died, he killed the guy. And then there's this bird on a stick. That's the official archaeological explanation of what this painting is. When I saw this, I thought, no, this is a shamanic journey. This is clearly what's going on here. And then I looked at Goodman's work, and this particular pose, interestingly, is exactly a pose that she had several people do. The incline shows in many other cave depictions, a particular, I forget what the degree is, 40 degrees or whatever this incline is, where they had people lay in that position with the arms out. You notice that he has a bird head and that there's a bird on a stick, which is also very active. This is an active totem symbol in many South American tribes as well as African tribes. What the people experienced when they did this journey was they went right up to circumpolar, and I believe that many of them had swan imagery. back to this, back to the womb at the center of the universe and where all of the knowledge comes from. This is where our archaic ancestors got their knowledge from. This is what they were doing in those caves. They were doing trance journeys. Perhaps there was medicine involved. Perhaps there was, plant medicine involved. They probably didn't need it because their consciousness was so fused with that. This particular cave painting, and the reason why he's erect, is to show that there's a vital process going on here, right? That this isn't a dead guy, and that he's kind of shape-shifting and morphing and quite possibly communicating with Cygnus, right? Cygnus was a big constellation, a prominent constellation at that time. So, okay, let me just see. All right, let's go to Chavot. Okay, Chavot predates Lasso. This is an amazing series of cave art, cave drawings, cave art. There's a documentary, if you're interested, it's called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams, that's all about Chavot. This stunned the archaeologists that found it. Now, what we have to think of, if like I said, what were they doing in these caves? Chavot goes deep, deep, deep into the ground, so they were clearly going in there with torchlight. What the archaeologists that excavated this cave and documented it, there's some quotes I have from them, because they experienced altered states of consciousness by being in contact with the artwork in this cave. And they talked about that because of the torchlight, the way that, this implies movement. I mean, look at the movement here of the horn, the movement of the lioness, and that by torchlight and by the contours of the cave, that it literally can induce a trance state. One of the archaeologists, Jean-Claude, says, to these people's way of thinking, those animal spirits were in the walls already. The painting only allowed the power to then seep into the real world. And again, that's exactly what the Aborigines say. I didn't have time to explain how the land holds the stories, but it's an integral part of their dream time. That all of the features of the land, every crevice, every tree, every rock, every curve of the land is part of their Dreamtime stories. And so this is part of what this archaic consciousness is showing. A lot of this imagery is not about hunting, it's about the spirits of these animals. So quite possibly what was going on in these caves had to do with shamanic dreaming and knowledge, that there may have been initiation going on. Certainly there could have been sexual magic going on, communication with totem animals, drawing in of spirits, certainly ancestral communication, all different kinds of things going on. Red ochre is also common. That's what this red is. It's very common in all throughout the Paleolithic and Mesolithic era, even into the Neolithic. And red ochre is, it's very easily found, but it's symbolic of blood, and it's menstrual blood. It's the blood of life. It's birth and death. It's believed that there were a lot of rituals that went on here about birth and death. Now, one thing I want to point out about these hands that come up in many caves, they say that this is kind of the artist's signature, or it's clan signatures. Only recently, probably in the last, 20 years, maybe even 10 years, some archaeologists have taken another look at these hands, because again, it was always assumed that it was men doing this. It was cavemen doing these paintings, and women were, I don't know what they thought women were doing. But what they've come to realize now is that by the dimensions and measurements of these hands, many of these are women's hands. So, I want you to think again also as women also being part of the artists here, being part of the creation of this. Caves themselves represent going underground, right? Again, like I said, I want you to think of Venus as ruler of Taurus, being drawn inward, going underground. And many of the caves and the way that their chambers are made and the way they did the artwork, it represents progressive stages of deeper consciousness. Interestingly, some of our ancient temples follow that, as that you have the outer temple and then you enter into the Holy of the Holies where only the initiates can go. This is true that they found also in these subterranean caves and intentionally built subterranean temples that start to show up around 10,000 to 6,000 BC. So to our archaic consciousness, as they're squeezing down into these passages, this is like going through the birth canal. It's like being birthed into a deeper consciousness that's of the earth itself. They would look at going into these caves as passageways between the worlds. Quite frequently, some of the most sacred spots in caves are where there were underground wells where water came. Water was always sacred to the goddess. In their consciousness, life and death process is not separated because it's not a linear kind of consciousness. It's a cyclical kind of consciousness. So we don't really know what the rituals were, but we can see it, and you can see it in the Neolithic monuments as they show up later, how birth and death are intimately intertwined, and that these places are a part of understanding that. In Chavot, in the deepest chamber of Chavot, there's this remarkable piece of art that's on this outcropping. It's actually, what's the word I want to say? It's an illusion. It's an illusion. That's how, how advanced the kind of artwork is. This is like I said, in the deepest and the oldest part of the cave. So here we have, this is a common symbol in much cave art. It's the vulva. So when you look at this front on, you're looking at, it looks like a woman. It's a woman's vulva and a woman's legs, but then it morphs into this bison. Oric, here we see mounting the vulva, and then as you come around the corner of this, it turns into this lioness. And this whole hall is considered the Hall of Lions. Part of what they see this as is that this is, because it's also on this outcropping, this may also have to do with a phallic kind of imagery. So that what they're showing here is a kind of fusion, between the procreative powers of the masculine and the feminine. This, may have something to do, to their consciousness, the fertility of one is the fertility of all. So, and the other point I wanted to make on this slide is that this is the age around this time, the astrological ages are shorter than these long time spans that I'm talking about. But this is about 2 cycles ago, was the Taurus age. And so vulva and the fallopian tubes and horns and all of these things become important imagery from that time. So the other point I wanted to make about this fertility of one species and is the fertility of all. Whatever rituals they were enacting there, or whatever this artwork was meant to do, it was clear, though, and it was clear from the discoverers and studiers of this cave, it was all about ecstatic connection. So keep that in mind, ecstatic connection. This is the Lamadolin caves that has this is what they call the reclining nudes. Interesting that I believe it was Picasso that visited this cave and said of this and Chavot and Lasso art, he walked out in dismay and said, we've learned nothing. meaning that their art was so advanced. So what we know of the reason why I put all these together is just to show again the prevalence of this imagery that goes across the world. This is Aboriginal. This is shows up in Ireland. It's the Sheila na gig. And this is also in, I believe this is in Africa. This is woman giving birth. Yeah, I don't need to say more about that. Okay. This is an extremely interesting cave etching. We have here a female form, pregnant. And if you follow her legs, what you notice here is that her legs are actually turning into fetlocks. So this is a woman. This is a woman under a bovine, and she's pregnant, and she's shape-shifting. So this is some indication of some kind of shamanka, some kind of shamanic work happening here. And what's even more interesting is that you have this serpent coming out of her vulva and circling back. So what we don't know what this means, but what we do know, what the artwork can suggest, is that there's some kind of maybe a totem communication, some kind of communication with the totem animal or totem of their tribe. There's a lot of things that we know about what female shamanka's roles are in current life tribes that we can extrapolate and look back at what they might be doing here. You know, she may be calling forth an impregnation of the spirit of that animal to call the totem of that tribe into her belly. This particular serpent imagery may be something about also parthenogenesis, that she is a symbol of the ultimate of creativity fertilizing herself through the serpent, which is, you know, as you know, an ancient goddess form, which I'll get into in a minute. So it could be a form of sympathetic magic, where she's imbuing her fertility onto herds of other animals. Like I said, this kind of consciousness that's immersed in you know, the fertility of one is the fertility of all. What I'm showing down here are the different forms of vulva as they show up in different cave art, very prominent and predominant across actually all of the world. This is an Algerian stone painting that shows exactly the power that comes out of the vulva to the man's generative organ, to the penis, to give him the power to hunt. We don't know if this is a human, if this is a representation of a woman or a goddess. With the upraised arms, it could be a woman in trance. What we do know from tribes is that quite frequently the women in the tribe do go into trance, where they become the husband's prey spiritually to lure them to the hunter. So some of the ritual that the women perform are to aid hunting. They also, the woman, and this is a little bit of the Venusian as the moving in between the worlds, and Venus as shamanka. The women also are the ones that guide the souls of the dead of the animals when the hunter brings back the prey. They're the ones that feed and honor. They create meals and they create rituals. In other words, they're acting as a psychopomp, as a guide of the soul. Souls of the dead between the worlds. Okay, this is just another form of vulva. These are more forms of the goddess. Just to show you, this is a very interesting one, which actually may have astrological references to it, and I think from studying this and reading up on this particular culture, this is Vinca, which is the Cusatini Tripelian, which is somewhere around the what we would say is Belgrade, Romania, area today. This particular girdle, and this is, I think this is 7,000 years old. This may actually be representing the 4 stages of Venus's cycle as she goes underground and as she does inferior conjunction, superior conjunction, and either maximum elongation, but most likely maximum brilliance. And this is something that's repeated that is associated with Venus and other artwork. The spiral is something I'll get into just a little bit later, but the spiral has so many different connotations and interpretations on it. It can be solar, it can be lunar, it can be Venusian. Anyway, it's too much to go into. Okay. This is some of Maria Gimbutas's work. As I said, this is the Kusitani Tropelian culture that she studied very deeply. And this is what she was doing. Because of her linguistic studies, she was taking these particular forms like the V and the X and the I and all of their variations and putting them together because it was her theory, and she didn't prove it before she died, that even though we say written language starts in Sumerian cuneiform, which is what I get into in part 2, around 3,000, 3,500 BC, what she was trying to show is that this is actual language. These things were just disregarded by archaeologists in the past as kind of like, you know, interesting little etchings that didn't really mean anything. There has recently been some Canadian archaeologists who have picked up her work and their own work, and their theory is that written language is quite possibly 40,000 years old. And boy, that would really throw things. That would really throw things for a loop if they're able to prove that. Okay, so now I just want to get into a little bit of the different forms of the goddess. I just have a few representations. The bird goddess is a fusion of the upper world and the lower world, because she also appears to be serpentine. This particular representation of the bird goddess is a bit phoenix-like, which is interesting. This particular representation is also phoenix-like in that it's kind of like it's like the cosmic egg with the fertilization and the continual renewal of life. In many cosmologies, the world is born of an egg out of the primordial sea. So the bird goddess then gets an association with both water and air. Let me think about that. And, again, we have a little bit of a representation of the exaggerated buttocks, but this is to show kind of upward movement. So the bird goddess and all of the association of the early divine feminine as she shows in bird form has a lot to do with the flight of the soul before birth and after death. She is also part of that imagery of the shamanka, of the one who guides along the tree of life, the pole between the worlds, because she can journey there. We also know that the egg is also associated with the snake, and that the snake and the bird are actual relatives, which is a little bit also, even though this is sperm, this is serpentine. So it's quite possibly some of what that representation is showing. Okay. A little bit continuation of the serpentine goddess. Some of you might know this one from Crete. Let me just think about this one. These particular lines that show here are considered water lines. So this is something that connects the serpentine energy with water. As we know, serpents move between the upper world and the lower world because they go down into holes, they go into caves. And so they also have a representation of, the clear representation of the shedding of their skin that then has a lot to do with the shedding of the lining of the uterus. And we know that, their imagery carries on serpentine and serpentine goddesses representing eternal life and death and immortality, but also connection with the dead, or the ability to communicate with the dead, the ability to move between those worlds, the ability to resurrect the dead, which is also figures very big in archaic consciousness and the Neolithic consciousness as well. Serpentine, as you know, is also associated with the kundalini and the dual, the Ida and the Pingala channel of the kundalini energy. So some people, and as we know, kundalini is the world. This is the world tree that's represented in our own biology and in an energetic form. It's and it's the passageway. So the connection between the worlds in a spiritual sense as we know it today, and what we know of kundalini science that we get from the Vedas. In yoga, it's understood that the human brain is not fully activated or enlightened until it's fertilized by the kundalini serpent energy that passes through the reptilian brain. And when that connection is made, again, when this serpentine energy has connected through all the poles, the mundus oxi, the pole between the worlds, enlightenment happens. As we know, then it later gets an association with the caduceus and healing. And here's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't know about Shiva. Before, and many of even Vedas, the Vedas have become patricized, and some of the things that used to be goddesses became gods. Surya, for one of them, which is the soul, which is the sun, actually used to be a goddess and is now considered male. The original manifestation, this exists still in Indian folklore and Indian folk art. The original manifestation of Shiva was called the Ardhanarishvara. And when Shiva Shakti originally appeared, it was exactly in this androgynous form. It was only later that it becomes separated, and and as we know, the serpent is also associated with Shiva Shakti energy. And it's only later, as we know also, that the serpent has a fall from grace, and rather than being the carrier of feminine wisdom and of serpentine power and the power to unite the worlds and the power to illumine and the power to resurrect, and I don't know, can I keep going on with all the different powers of what the serpentine feminine is associated with? It's only later where serpents start getting killed by hero gods. Indra kills the serpent, and Marduk in Babylon kills Tiamat, who is the original creatress goddess. She's the serpent dragon, the primordial ocean goddess. And then, of course, we go into the Garden of Eden, blah, blah, blah. Okay. This form of this serpentine goddess, by the way, I said you probably recognize that one. It comes from Knossos in Crete. Crete was the last surviving equal gender society that showed no signs of male domination, no walled citadels, no fortifications, no temples to gods, etc., etc. And it was the last surviving matrifocal culture. Okay. You may or may not know this lady. This is the Venus of Lascaux. And here's where we start to get into, I'm not going to talk about this a lot, but it shows in Neolithic finding somewhere around 10,000 BC that the marking of time to our ancient ancestors had to do with the combination of Soli, lunar, and Venusian calendars. So the counting of time by the sun, the moon, and Venus's cycles were an intricate part, specifically in the Neolithic world. It shows up also in Babylon later when it's written down in stone, but it shows in a lot of the in a lot of the ancient in the Neolithic monuments like Newgrange, Stonehenge, etc. So those are some of the more known ones. This is Venus of Lascaux. She has 13 notches on her horn. I just want to note that, you know, they have said that this is certainly a lunar reference, but the possibility is that this is also a very early reference to the lunar Venusian solilunar Venus cycle I was talking about. 13 notches on the horn can be, you know, the 13 moons of the 28 days, but we also know of the lunar cycle, but we also know that Venus orbits 13 times in the 8 years, completing her 5-point inferior conjunction where she forms her pentagram. Also, Venus correlates with the moon, and this is where the two of them get syncretized in later goddesses, where we see a lot of cross between the goddess as like the original slide I had up of Moon and Venus, because in a mean ratio, it's not an exact number, but it's like 263, 265. Venus spends 260 days as morning star and 260 days as evening star, and then the rest of the time is in her inferior and superior conjunction. That equals exactly just about 9 lunar months, which is the gestation cycle. So there's an interconnectedness that goes on there. But here's the other point I'm bringing out, which you'll start to see developing in Neolithic, in Mesolithic, Neolithic consciousness, the horn and the association of the horn with the goddess. It definitely shows up later, but why that's also relative to Venus as well as the moon. You may or may not know that Venus has phases. Not everybody's aware of that. It is visible when we're again, think archaic ancestors without streetlights or electricity. It is visible to the naked eye. We just don't see it now. But as Venus goes through her, here she is in her evening star phase, and here she is in her morning star phase. This particular point is noting maximum brilliancy, and here is maximum elongation. This is when she's in, and this is a point that a lot of our ancestors did mark. Maximum brilliancy of Venus was significant to them. And when Venus is in her maximum brilliancy is when she's in crescent phase, not when she's in full phase. When she's full, she's already way over on the other side of the sun, going into her longer underworld journey. And she's not at her brightest then. It's exactly when she's in crescent, which is when she's at her, and in fact, right now in the sky, Venus has reached maximum, you probably noticed her, she's reached her maximum elongation, and she's about to reach maximum brilliancy. I think it's around February 12th or something like that. So keep your eye on the evening sky and watch her, because this is the phase that she's approaching from here to here. Our ancient ancestors would have noticed this. Like I said, I just want to show you this slide before, because when you look at this, and if you're standing here on Earth and you see Venus as morning star and evening star over the course of her beautiful cycle that she follows, you're standing in the middle of two horns. Our ancient ancestors would certainly have noticed that, the way that she embraces the earth with her horns. And here is an actual composite of what half of the bull's horn looks like that Venus forms. Like I said, think of Venus as ruler of Taurus. Another interesting thing, Nick Anthony Fiorenza had this up. During the Venus transit that we just had, which we know was a very rare occurrence in 2012, Venus, when she went into her retrograde cycle, where her position was in the sky was actually quite interesting in that she traced the horns of the bull exactly in the constellation. Now, even archaeologists are starting to admit that some of these cave paintings have constellation significance. And here's one of them, which seems pretty obvious. So again, this is something that, had this happened during time of our ancient ancestors, this would have been something of significance, something they would have noticed. They're much more keen observers than we are. Okay, so we know that the moon can be, as I said, the moon goes through its phases, its crescent phases, and it's very obvious. So the moon, both moon and Venus, can be associated with the crescent, which is why we, like I said, later on we see the goddesses syncretized with both moon and Venus and their horned goddesses. What I want to point out is that as we get into the Neolithic era here in Newgrange, look at this. This is the age of Taurus when this was built and at the height of its use. And I'm going to talk to you in a minute about Newgrange. But the other thing that was occurring leading up to the age of Taurus, this is another extraordinary site called Catal, Hoyek in Turkey, where there's a predominance of horns, and the archaeologists again have said that this reference is to the fallopian tubes, because Catal Hoyek, this is the predominant goddess form that's found there in the underground chambers where they were interring the dead. And so they see this also as an understanding of the fallopian tubes and the cycle of birth and death and rebirth and death and rebirth, etc. What's also important to know, in the Neolithic world, the domestication of the Oric was a huge accomplishment. Those horned beings that you see, those are wild cows. They were not domesticated, and they were vicious. And there's, stories that get passed down of how many people were killed trying to domesticate the Oric. But once the cow was domesticated, it was a huge accomplishment. And eventually, cows and milk become, a kind of currency. They are, of course, associated, that part of this is happening during the age of Cancer, right, when the cows are being domesticated. And so they do get associated with nurturing and the milk of life. As we move later here into the Taurus age and looking again at this symbolism, clearly this looks like the bull's head, the cow's head. Let me just think, yeah, we'll go here first. Okay. Another interesting feature of the planet Venus is that Venus is the only other body, planetary body, that can cast a shadow on the Earth. Again, we don't know this because of city light. So the Sun, the Moon, and Venus are the only three planets that are bright enough to cast a shadow. This is an experiment that was done with a tube and photographic paper, where they put this tube, as you can see, and the photographic contrast, and pointed it at Venus when she was at maximum brilliance with a glyph on there to see if it would photograph. And the light of Venus itself created this glyph on this photographically sensitive paper. Okay, now we have to get to Newgrange. You remember the outside image of Newgrange, which was the horns and the, looked like the Taurus head. This is the inside of Newgrange. and this isn't the only monument that follows this particular suggestion of what may be ovaries, what may be, coming down into the uterus, into the womb. There's many other temples, not just in Ireland or all throughout this era. The Hypergeum is another one I'm thinking of that's in Malta that follows this, and many of the ancient, I'm losing my words, many of the ancient sites have this. It's a huge mound, and this is the only accessible part. It's this long chamber and these these little offshoots. Okay, so Newgrange is in the Boyne Valley and is associated in ancient mythology, going back into Irish mythology, with Boann. And it's associated with what they would call the founders of the Irish race, the Tuatha De Danann. And there's a lot of stories of these mythic gods and goddesses that later on became the fairy folk in Ireland. They went underground, in other words. There's a massive amount of these, of Newgrange-like, what they call passage graves or womb tombs. I don't remember the number, but in the Boyne Valley alone, which is where Newgrange is, there's at least 28 of these. 2 associated with Newgrange are Douth and Noth. Now, in the Boyne Valley, this river runs through the Boyne Valley, and as I said, Boann, the goddess that has been associated with that area, is a fertility goddess. She's the goddess of the Boyne River, and she's associated with sacred white cows, and the milk of that sacred white cow is supposedly the Milky Way. In one of the Tuatha De Danann myths, one of the gods, the Dagda, who is by the way, the Tuatha De Danann translates to children of the goddess Danu. Danu, this is another goddess creatress myth that hasn't necessarily survived as far as a popular understanding. But Danu was the creatress goddess of the Tuatha De Danann, therefore of the Irish people. So the Dagda, this particular god, impregnates Boann. They kind of have an affair. It's getting a little Venusian here. And in order to hide the affair, he makes the sun stand still for 9 months so that she can gestate what appears to be this baby in one day. And Angus was born. So he was gestated and born in one day. And Angus, later in the mythology and still to this day, is considered a god of love. And through a series of events, he becomes the resident of Newgrange. Now, there's been a lot of talk about Newgrange and what's happening at Newgrange. We know that Newgrange is aligned to the winter solstice sunrise, and that there's this roof box here in the doorway, and the sun comes up through here and lights this chamber. I think it's about 5 days on either side of the winter solstice, but most precise on the exact sunrise of the winter solstice. And now, when we start to put some of the mythology together with what is Newgrange, and then something else I'm going to share with you that you might not know about Newgrange because it's more recent research. One of the myths of the Tuatha De Danann say that one of the deceased heroes was brought by the gods to Newgrange, and here's the quote, so that they could put a soul into him so he could talk to me every day, i.e. to bring him back to life. Now, we know the winter solstice sun is associated with the sun at its weakest point. It's when the sun dies. It goes to its its most southward position before it starts its northward climb back up to the zenith, where we find it in midsummer. So the death and birth of the sun is a big part of this time of the year. Newgrange itself, though, is constructed kind of like a womb and a tomb of the mother goddess. they call it a tomb, yet there's no human remains found there. And this is true of several of the kind of things that they've called passage graves or womb tombs. There's not really human remains there found. So it could be part of them working with the bones of the dead there, but not necessarily interring them there. You know, there can be a lot of things. Again, there may be sexual rites going on here at the rebirth of the sun, the calling back of the ancestors, the bringing back into the womb of those. Now, the reason why this correlation is important to know and how it relates to Venus is that what they found in their recent research, this is what they call a lintel box, which is above the doorway. And they couldn't quite understand about Newgrange why they needed to have this roof box, because the sun clearly comes through this doorway. Well, it does focus the rays of the sun, but it's already happening. The chamber's already illuminated. So this is almost a non-essential. And if anything we know of our ancient ancestors, they didn't do non-essential things. So this led some researchers to start to look at what else might be happening here. What they found is that based on Venus's cycle, and again, this gets to what I was saying before about the synchronizing of ancient calendars with the Soli lunar Venusian cycle. Because, and as you may or may not know, this is what the Mayans did with the Dresden Codex. Venus's cycle was an integral part of the wheels of their interlocking calendars, because she's like the metronome of the universe. Right? Every 8 years, you can, with absolute precision, return to a very specific point in the sky. And, she will do that like a metronome. So this lintel box is marked with 8 of these X's. So they started to think, oh, this might have to do with the 8-year cycle of Venus. Anyway, in short, what this research shows and has proven is that once out of every 8-year cycle, Venus will rise at her maximum brilliance a certain distance ahead of the sun, the winter solstice sun, and her light will illuminate this chamber before the sunrise. So you have a special occurrence that happens every 8 years in Venus's cycle, where she will be aligned at that particular position in the sky, rising ahead of the sun, and it's her pale light that first penetrates the chamber. Now, in my own correlations, I remembered from the Aboriginal people, they told me that they also have a ritual where they, and it has to do with Venus's rising. And I believe, if I remembered correctly, I was trying to find a reference for the time of the year that they do this ritual, that it would be their correlation to the winter solstice, which would be the summer solstice for them, which would be June. And what they told me was they stay up all night, and they have a particular stick that they use that's called, it's like a talking stick, and it connects the worlds. And they wait for it's a specific Venus's rise. They wait for Venus's rise when she's at her maximum brilliance, and they say that she trails a cord to the land of the dead behind her, which is part of what they see, the way they see her light. She's almost comet-like to them. She trails a cord to the land of the dead, and through the use of staying up all night and doing the ritual that they do, and this particular stick that they have, they can communicate with their ancestors. So knowing that and seeing this, it's clear that Newgrange had something to do perhaps with also death, resurrection, the connection of the ancestors and the bringing back of the ancestral spirits. We're getting into the time within history where some of these things are starting to be passed orally. and where we can start to see or that we know of today, that still survive today, some of these traditions. And we can start to see that some of these mystery traditions, if there were initiations going on here, for example, just like I said in the caves, some of these traditions today, and I'll get into this into part 2, Venus is the illuminator. She is the one who brings enlightenment. As we know, she's honored in many civilizations. Let's say the Mayans also honor her, the Mayans, Aztec, where she's seen as masculine form, Viracocha and Quetzalcoatl, the bringer of civilization, the bringer of light, the bringer of illumination. There's deeper mysteries also that go on. This is part of what happens in mythology. I forgot to mention this earlier, and I'm just going to put it out there now. When we hear indigenous mythology, and this is part of why it hasn't been documented and it's brushed off as if, you know, mythical people or indigenous peoples are more rudimentary than we are. So let's say, you know, the story about Skywoman, etc. Well, it's like, you know, to the Western mind, scientific mind, it's like, oh, that's a very simplistic story. This woman falls out of a hole in the sky and, you know, the animals help her create Earth. Big deal. Well, what I learned from the Aborigine and other indigenous peoples that I've come across, all of their myths are secretly guarded, and they encode deeper and deeper mysteries that are only revealed as you go through initiations within the tribe. So they will not tell you the depth of what those myths mean. So when you hear the story like, oh, Coyote grabbed the bag and threw it up in the sky and that's how the Milky Way was born, you know, it sounds rudimentary to us, but they're not going to share the depth of that myth. But that myth will get progressively deeper and deeper. It will be a moral play. It will be a spiritual play. It will have, you know, prescriptions for life and prescriptions for spiritual development that's only revealed. The same myth will only be revealed, the depth of that, deeper and deeper as you go. So sometimes when we hear the stories of these places, like, you know, like I was talking about Boan and you know, her impregnation and the hero that they brought here to be reborn, we do know, and especially with this significance with Venus's lighting this chamber, we do know that in later Western mystery traditions that carry through Egypt and came out of the Fertile Crescent, which is where we're going in the next one, where we start to get more elaborate myth and depth of that because it was written down, is that initiates were often ritually killed and resurrected symbolically to the light of Venus specifically. So this is something we're going to get into. I'm going to talk a little bit about, in part 2, about the Western mystery traditions and following the light of Venus there. I have one more slide and something I just want to say about spirals. Robert Graves was saying in The White Goddess, and he was pointing out that if you trace your finger along the edge of this spiral like this, that it turns around and comes back out. And so he is saying that maybe to the ancient mind, spirals are a lot about, you know, not just marking time, because that's what some people have said. If I go back here, and they talk about these spirals, that these are marking time, or triple goddess, etc. What he's saying is that these can be very intimate and intricate symbols of birth and rebirth, resurrection, death, life, etc. What I also noticed is thinking again of, you know, Venus's path, or any retrograde, but this is Venus in particular I showed you earlier. Look at this, right? So Venus's representation with life, death, and rebirth shows up mostly when you look at her as a whole archetype, as ruler of both Taurus and Libra. And we're going to go specifically into that level of her in part 2 when I talk about Inanna. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there, and let's just see if there's any questions or thoughts or things people want to talk about.
You have so much wonderful information. It's probably taking a while to process.
Yeah.
And if you do have a question, feel free to just unmute yourself, and you can talk or you can type. Yes, so much good information. Thank you. In the spiral, do you see how far back you had the one pictures where suddenly the spiral is showing up a lot? Do you see that in some of the ones that are
Yes,
the few thousand years old?
it goes further back than Newgrange, and that's there's some of that in the Vinca, so you can maybe say you're going back 8, 9, 10,000 years.
But you don't see that in any of the cave painting things.
In the caves, you know what? There are petroglyphs, but I don't remember the dates of the petroglyphs because this also figures in some Native American petroglyphs. The spiral is there also, and I'm not sure what, I'd have to look up what the petroglyph dates are, but they may be somewhere around, maybe around the same era, 3,000-4,000 BC.
Okay. One person is asking she would like to hear a little more next time about how this affects Venus
and astrology. Yes,
yeah.
Next time, once I lay out the groundwork of just revisiting the archetype, I mean, I wanted to kind of try to immerse you into the consciousness so that you might feel it more, because I'm talking sensate Venus. I'm talking the visceral, direct experience of something, okay? So as we get more into the more detailed mythologies and how she evolved through Sumerian Babylon into astrology, I will tie that into the psycho-spiritual meanings that we could attribute to her today at the end of part 2.
Okay. You know, one thing that struck me was Venus in Taurus is kind of like Mercury in Virgo.
Yeah.
In modern astrology, it feels like we're really much more comfortable with the planets in their masculine signs.
Exactly.
Than in their feminine
Yeah, no, I'm right there with you. I mean, this whole inner side of Venus has been so overlooked as ruler of Taurus, and yes, I will get into that more in part 2. Again, like I said, I wanted to paint a broad brushstroke of more of an immersive experience here for part 1.
Okay.
What is
a comment? I certainly felt it and directly experienced my womb as a cosmic womb, a vessel of life, yet this whole topic is still so mysterious.
Yes.
Well, I think I do know that I used to teach childbirth classes after I had my daughter, because who I was before I gave birth and after that experience, it was like I gave birth to me as well as her.
Yeah.
And I was really feeling that, sensing that, which sounds like this other person was too when you were describing, especially some of the really ancient material.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and what that meant to our archaic consciousness, you know, that the biology of woman and how miraculous that is.
And it's, yeah, and in an older culture, how
Yeah.
often very dangerous that passage is.
Yeah, absolutely. That too.
Yeah.
Well,
And when
yeah. Well, who is this? Is this Lindsay?
Lindsay.
Lindsley, hi.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and you know, it's interesting, again, a reason why we need to revisit her story. Pluto's transit in Capricorn is, you know, lighting up the Cancer-Capricorn axis, right? If we look at it historically, the last time when Pluto was opposite in Cancer is when we had, and the Cancer-Capricorn axis, by the way, can be associated with gender assignment as we see it in today's society, right? You have the classic Cancer and Capricorn. The woman stays home and takes care of the children, and the man has the career and he's out in the world. That's a classic Cancer-Capricorn duality and or opposition that's part of that axis that informs our culture today. And Pluto's transit there is, you know, we're seeing it all stirred up again. When Pluto was in Cancer before, we had a testing of the shifting of the gender roles, because World War II was happening then, and women were kind of forced out into the workplace, right? And that's where a lot of that, unfortunately, they were forced back into the homes when the men returned from war. That's a whole other story. But it was a kind of forced liberation that happened at the time, the breaking of those traditional roles. And women drove the economy and society. And now, so now we have it in the opposite point, right? So now Pluto's in Capricorn. And, you know, I've been waiting for it. I mean, I'm going to say, I'm not going to say I'm not surprised, but I've been waiting for, where is the backlash of conservatism? You know, where is the tyranny? Where is the authoritarianism, which is part of that archetype that, you know, not that I want to see it manifest, I don't, but perhaps for evolution to happen, it needs to manifest. We need to look at it again, because Pluto, as we know, is ultimately about transforming those old structures, those old outgrown structures, and evolving them. So, you know, again, another reason why I think, you know, remembering this kind of material too, remembering her story, remembering our archaic, because we think we're so immersed in the patriarchal model of society, we think it's the only model. You know, I didn't mention, if anybody's seen the movie Zeitgeist, they mention in there a new economic model, which surprisingly they call the Venus Project, right? And you know, and they outline this economic, you know, this experimental new economic model. And one of the first things they say has to happen in order to implement the kind of Venusian economy that they envision is that all of the world's resources are held in community. That nobody owns the world's resources. That alone, that shift alone, would radically restructure this, what we think is the only model for society, but may also go back to what is our archaic Venusian consciousness, right?
Fascinating. Well, it is you've done a lot of research with Pluto through the signs. Do you notice a difference between the masculine and feminine signs?
Do you mean as far as social events or what?
Yeah. Well, in just the patterns of how Pluto behaves in the masculine signs versus the feminine signs, not just by earth and water in that, but also by the polarity.
By the polarity. Yeah, I can't say I have it. I've seen it so much, and I'd have to look back and look at it from the yin-yang perspective, from the masculine feminine. I mean, I've looked at it mostly from what Pluto brings out of that archetype, you know, collectively. But yeah, that's an interesting point. But you would think, I mean, well, it's interesting. Capricorn is a yin sign. Yet it's ruled by a masculine planet.
Well,
right?
I think that's one of the fascinating things about the old rulership system, is that every planet had its masculine and feminine expression.
Exactly, yeah.
And that's you know, actually that's what pulled me back to the old tradition once I really realized that.
Right.
Because it seemed like, well, somewhere in there we got so into the masculine perspective that that just seemed to be the natural logical progression, that we would emphasize that.
Right. Right. Yeah, well, we're immersed in it. And, sometimes it helps to define so that, to gain some objectivity. We're just born in it. We're just so immersed for it. I mean, that there's a creator God is just a kind of, yeah, like, but really when you think about it, is it logical? Like, is it really logical?
Well, it's wonderful that you and all these other people are looking at this, because when you're so immersed, it becomes invisible. You don't even know that there's a possibility of a difference.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. So somehow we need to remember. We need to that's part of why I feel this material is timely to revisit again, because we do need to remember and reground ourselves in other possibilities. So I'm just looking at some of the comments here. Thank you, Isabel. She's saying amazing info, connecting at a deep level, activation going on. That's what I was going for, visceral direct experience. Linda, feminine needs to be made more conscious. You better believe that. Victoria,
balance back.
Yeah, Victoria Ramos, perhaps Pluto in the depth of its power will unleash the unpredictability of the feminine psyche, female psyche, which is feared by most, the wild woman. Yes, that would be an interesting, exactly, the primal feminine, right? Where is that? Where is that energy? Who's this? Lindsley. There's a new wave of feminism amongst the millennials. They're talking about our bodies being natural too.
Yeah, it is interesting how these cycles are going. And, thinking about that comment on Pluto releasing the unpredictability of the female psyche, we really, Saturn's another one that we think of it, okay, it's a masculine planet, and we put all of our words on it as very, very masculine, but the Capricorn, you do have the feminine side.
Yeah.
So maybe Pluto will also help us understand that other side of Saturn, which, as a Capricorn myself, I've been working on all my life.
Well, one thing we say in evolutionary astrology is that specifically the Cancer-Capricorn axis, evolution happens by one step forward, two steps back. And I think that's just what we're seeing now, right? There's a kind of retrograde movement, socially, back into what we thought, I mean, you've heard people saying it, what we thought we were done with, 100 years ago or 50 years ago or whatever. And so there's a necessary kind of backtracking, and perhaps, that's part of the yin movement of that sign, is that you've got to go. I mean, I always see the ancient symbol of Capricorn, the sea goat, right? So there's the goat that climbs the mountain, and there's progress, and there's growth, and there's conquering, and that's all very heroic movement. Terrestrial journeys above the ground are kind of heroic movement, climbing up the mountain. Yet it's dragging a fishtail, which is the polarity, which is Cancer. And, to me, that says we do not fully evolve unless we evolve our emotions along with it. Unless we evolve, and if we were to say our emotions are feminine, unless we evolve that along with it. That's part, to me, of what the sea goat is about. They're intimately intertwined.
Well, thank you so much. We probably ought to wrap up.
Okay.
And we'll see you next week. And thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. I guess I should just stop recording, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
And if you could send me your recording, because I want to make sure that one little part where my power went a little funky and I lost some audio, that's not missing from the whole thing.
All right. Okay. I'm just waiting for everybody. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And if you want the easiest way to send it, if you've ever seen, I'm just typing it in, wetransfer.com.
Yeah, I use Hightail.
Hightail works.
Yeah, yeah. Okay,
if you
everyone.
didn't have access. So thank you.